Our last lecture, we were standing from the perspective of Jerusalem, from the perspective of the Hebrews, and looking at the historical developments from that position. Now what we need to do for this lecture is hop on a prehistoric helicopter and fly our way to Rome. You might want to use the attached overhead aerial photograph of the Colosseum to help you guide your helicopter into the proper position. And now we want to take a look at what is developing during this period in the Roman Empire. How the Roman Empire is expanding and how the Roman Empire and what is going on in Israel connect. Roman history has been pretty long to this point. The city of Rome was founded in 753 BC, and the Romans had a lengthy period of time of republic. The Roman Republic, unfortunately, degenerated into a series of civil wars that were finally ended by the first Roman emperor, Augustus, who became emperor in 27 BC, reigned until 14 AD. So Augustus is a contemporary with Jesus. Augustus really changed how the Roman world functioned in many ways from the top down. The most important thing he did, in many ways, was he ended the civil wars. He retired many of the soldiers. He demilitarized the Roman Empire, and in the process, attained one of the great accomplishments in all of human history, and that is the great Pax Augusta. Literally, the peace of Augustus, sometimes called the Pax Romana. The Pax Augusta or Pax Romana is something that is almost mind-boggling to the modern person. In American history, we have known perhaps 20 years of peace at any one time in American history. What Augustus began was a period of just about 200 years of peace. It's hard to imagine 200 years of peace for anybody. It is an extraordinary accomplishment, unparalleled, as far as I know, in human history. The Pax Augusta. The Romans were serious about making the peace and retaining the peace. The age of Augustus also came to be known as one of the great ages of literature, the golden age of Latin literature, with writers during this period such as Virgil and Livy thriving. It was a time of fiscal stability and prosperity. One of the things that the Romans did was they got organized about fiscal matters in the Roman Empire, how they ran the Roman imperial budget. They actually budgeted. They did things like having censuses to know where people lived and where people worked in order that they could know how many taxes they needed to collect or how many taxes they could collect in a particular area, as well as what they needed in a particular area in terms of infrastructure, aqueducts, auxiliary troops, etc. Whenever the Romans held a census anywhere, and they didn't do it every decade like modern countries do it. They did it periodically, especially the Romans did a census when they newly came to rule in a particular area. They wanted to know what they had. The Romans would then impose their own tax system. The Romans didn't do taxes like modern people. There was no IRS in the Roman Empire, no Internal Revenue Service, no company of the government whose job it was to collect taxes. The Romans, in fact, contracted taxes out to private companies. Those private companies would bid for the right to collect taxes in a Roman province, and those companies would make money by collecting more taxes than they had to. They had to collect a certain amount of taxes to pay off Rome. Any taxes they collected over and above that, they made money. So all of the economic incentive for these companies of publicani, as they were called, all the incentives were to be as corrupt as possible, to try to squeeze as many taxes out of people as they possibly could. And of course, from whom do they squeeze out the taxes? People who couldn't protect themselves from the tax collectors. That is, it's not going to be the wealthy that they are going to squeeze. It's going to be the people of modest means who were worth squeezing to get this. And so tax collectors in the Roman Empire had a notoriously bad reputation. The Herod family in Israel were close personal friends of the Augustus family. And the connection between Herod and his sons and Augustus and his family was multifaceted and very important throughout the reign of both. And we'll come back to that later on, which is, of course, one of the reasons why the Herod and his family continue to hold positions of authority under the Augustan Empire. Another thing that Augustus was famous for, and people often stereotype the Romans as being immoral people, but in fact, Augustus was a man of high moral values, not necessarily practice, but high moral values. And he, for example, promulgated a law in the Roman Empire that made adultery illegal. He cracked down on any number of sensual crimes, and he took these things very seriously. So seriously, in fact, that when Ovid, the famous Latin poet, wrote a book called the Ars Amatoria, which was essentially a book on how to pick up women and seduce women, Augustus had him exiled. It was a great piece of literature, but it didn't meet the moral standards. Even Augustus's own daughter, who was famous for her sensual creativity, shall we say, he exiled her when he found out about her behavior, and he never was reconciled to her. So Augustus took these moral reforms very seriously. Augustus was the first Roman emperor of the so-called Julio-Claudian dynasty, the first 5 emperors of Rome, lasting from 27 BC up till 68 AD. Those first 5 emperors are Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. A couple of words on these emperors besides Augustus. Tiberius was the emperor when Jesus was crucified and raised. That probably in the year 33, I think, is the best chronological reconstruction, although many people will place it more like 30. Caligula was his successor. Caligula was almost a child. He was very young when he was emperor. His name, by the way, is a nickname. It means little boots, which was not necessarily a compliment. Caligula thought himself to be divine. It wasn't unusual for emperors after they died to receive the vote of the Senate that named them a god. Caligula said, why wait? He'd rather be a god now. And in fact, he had a statue of himself made up in the guise of Apollo. And he even gave orders that that statue was to be put up in the Holy of Holies in the temple in Jerusalem. He sent the statue over to Israel. Thankfully, the local governor in Israel, when the Hebrews protested about this statue, he did not actually put it up in the temple. He sort of stalled, and it was a good thing he did, because the Hebrews would have caused a great revolt as a result of that. He ultimately, Caligula, died in 41, and the statue never was put in that position. Claudius was his successor. Claudius is often treated as a silly, drooling fool. He apparently had a speech defect. He stuttered a lot. He drooled on himself. He was a very funny-looking man, but he was quite a smart man and actually quite a good emperor, although his wife didn't think so. But in any case, Claudius, for our purposes, didn't hold a lot of importance in the eastern part of the empire. Nero, of course, is famed for many reasons, but a couple of them are worth calling your attention to. First of all, he gets a lot of bad press. His first few years as a ruler were not too bad, but when things got bad for him was in the year 64, the Great Fire of Rome. There's a Great Fire of Rome, and after the Fire of Rome, Nero took the opportunity in the area that had burned to build a gigantic and elaborate palace for himself. We call it the Golden House. Little bits of it remain in Rome to this day. Because of this, many people at the time blamed Nero for the fire. The rumor went around that Nero had started the fire. Nero needed a scapegoat, and he turned against Christians. We're not exactly sure why, but in any case, he launched a rather fierce persecution of Christians in the city of Rome. There's not any evidence that it went much farther than that, but famously in this great persecution under Nero in the year 64, up until his death in 68, both Peter and Paul were probably executed. It was also during the reign of Nero that the Jews revolt against the Roman Empire, a full-scale revolt under the leadership of the Zealots, and the Jewish War lasted from 66 to 73. We'll talk more about it later. The reign of Nero also came to be known as the Silver Age of Latin literature. The most famous author of that period was Seneca. Seneca, who had served for a time, indeed, as Nero's personal tutor.